Hello and welcome to the Satluj TV Podcast. Our returning guest today is Principal Advisor to the Sikh Federation UK and founding member of the Sikh network that produced the acclaimed Sikh Manifesto. He's also a highly accomplished civil servant who was honoured by Her Majesty the Queen herself receiving an OBE. Dabinderjit Singh, welcome. Thanks for joining us once again today.
Hi there, Angus. Nice to join you again.
A pleasure as always. Now, Dabinderjit, an awful lot's happened over the last few weeks and particularly since the release of the updated Sikh Manifesto. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to maybe take a little look behind the scenes of what's been happening here in the UK on some pretty significant developments in recent weeks for the community. Now, the areas I'd like to cover today, if we could, are firstly, of course, this Derby City Council motion that was passed recently covering the 1984 attacks. I'd also like to take a look at the International Sikh Convention, which happened a couple of weeks ago in Wolverhampton, what was discussed and concluded there. And then finally, maybe just take a quick look at the actions that have been taken since that convention. So to kick us off, Dabinderjit, can we take a look at this Derby City Council motion? Obviously, clearly a brilliant indication of some very successful lobbying by the community. Can you give us a little bit of background, what sort of led up to that motion? What happened behind the scenes there?
Well, Angus, in your introduction, you mentioned the Sikh Manifesto and also the general election. So as we sit here, we're probably about 3 months into a new government. And one of the things that happened after the general election was in Slough, there was an attempt to put a 1984 genocide motion down. And there was actually lots of publicity in July around that. And actually what happened was that the Conservative leader of the council used an archaic rule to make sure there was no debate. And the plan is to bring that motion back, but I think it has to wait 6 months in Slough. So that was probably the starting of what happened in Derby on the 18th of September. As more and more Sikhs realised, it was really important to go to our respective councils and in the 40th anniversary year to get motions passed. Now, one of the learning experiences from Slough was that the individuals that led that were a few independent councillors. And one of the things we've emphasised, it's really important to look at your council and the makeup of the council and try and get the majority party to put down the motion. So in Derby, again, the Liberal Democrats, which are a minority party in Derby, put down a motion. In that motion, they used the word genocide in the draft motion. But actually what happened was the Labour councillors, and there's a majority of Labour councillors, introduced an amendment. Now, this is politics. This is what happens when mainstream parties don't lead. They often then have to follow. And where we've ended up in Derby is that a motion was passed that didn't use the word genocide. Yeah, that's a minor negative point. But overall, as you said in previous broadcasts, if you look at the totality of the wording, it's actually a much stronger motion because the emphasis is not just on what happened in November 1984, as we're marking the 40th anniversary of what happened in Delhi and in cities actually throughout northern India. But it also emphasized quite heavily the events of June 1984. So if you look at this globally, there have been motions, particularly in America, in different states, that have entirely focused on November 1984 because it's an easier subject where you can raise the issue, because it was done in front of the world's eyes in terms of Sikhs had ties put around their necks, women were raped, etc. However, the events of June 1984, we must remember, the whole of Punjab was sealed. The media were expelled. Therefore, everything that happened in that period was done behind closed doors. Now, in Derby, what's actually happened is they've emphasised the events of June 1984 as well as November 1984. But in addition, the Labour councillors produced an action for the leader of the council, who's a Labour leader, to write to the Deputy Prime Minister asking when a Labour government will start or the timeline for that independent public inquiry that Labour has promised, not just once, not just twice, but actually consistently over a decade since the papers came out in 2014. And we think this creates real pressure on the government. Now, on top of that, I've sent what we termed an ideally worded 1984 Sikh genocide motion to a number of councillors in a number of other towns following Derby. And we are expecting in the coming weeks Labour-led councils to pass motions, debate motions, using the word genocide in the wording, because if the Indian legal system, the Supreme Court, Delhi High Court, CBI, the Prime Minister of India has used the word genocide in the context of November 1984, we think it's really important to mention that in the wording of the motion. Now, they've never talked about June 1984 being a genocide. However, we think that's just a semantics at this stage. And if Labour-led councils start to write to not just the Deputy Prime Minister, actually it should be the Foreign Secretary and the Home Secretary. And we've written to the council leaders to make sure that letter goes to the Foreign Secretary and Home Secretary. And the reason for that is actually the Foreign Secretary who would have to make the announcement in Parliament of a public inquiry. And it would be the Home Secretary who would then sort out the logistics of all public inquiries. And we think that this is actually a really positive development that should result in a Labour government living up to its promises, because they're not just now getting the message from the community, they're getting it from their own elected councillors and leaders across the UK.
I think there's a rabbit hole I don't want to go down too far on this, but I almost can't let the subject go, is that it's very interesting. There's very much a Labour-leaning support towards the community. And what I've noticed, certainly for quite some time, is that the Conservatives, that there's always been a bit of a brick wall, should we call it? I think that's almost even euphemistically putting it, a bit of a brick wall from the Conservative side. That is the right wing, for our audience overseas, the right wing of the UK. There does seem to be, well, again, I'll euphemistically say, a reluctance to pursue this whole issue. And of course, you yourself referred to that it's Labour councils that we are primarily targeting with motions like this. And it is, of course, the Labour government. It was a Conservative government, of course, in power at the time in 1984, Margaret Thatcher, and of course, all the implications of potential collusion and collaboration there. Do you think, and again, I don't want to go too far down this road today, maybe this is for another discussion, but do you feel there is a party line divide in how the Sikh community are treated here in the UK?
Angus, I've been around, I was born in the UK, and I remember members of Parliament, Conservative members of Parliament, I'll name them, Terry Dix, John Watson Slough, that were very vocal in the 70s and 80s about Khalistan. People forget this, they were very vocal about it. And therefore, you need to look at this in the wider context. I think what's happened is in that period, from 79 to 1990, when Margaret Thatcher was in power, there is a big question mark of what the Conservatives did in the context of 1984. Now, we never knew this until 2014, so it's only 30 years after the event. And I think having had a Conservative government for 14 years that lived through that, we've actually worked very closely with the Conservatives in opposition. So this was in 2003 when the Sikh Federation was officially launched in the UK. Oliver Letterman, the Shadow Home Secretary, came to the launch. It was in the national papers. And therefore, we've had this sort of love-hate relationship with the Conservative Party, which was very positive when they were in opposition from about 2003 onwards. But when they came to power, the relations were fine. But when the papers came out in 2014, the shutters started to come down because they were worried about the public perception of what a British Prime Minister, who just happened to be a Conservative at the time, did. And I think the Labour Party have milked that for 10 years. But now's the time when we want the Labour Party and the Labour government to come good on those promises. And this is just one of the issues. I know we're going to touch on others. So I think we're not naive to think politicians irrespective of which party they belong to, are often, when they're in government, pressured by foreign governments, in this case, the Indian government. And so it'll be interesting to see whether the Labour government live up to a promise, which is actually quite narrow, which is to look at UK government involvement in the events of June 1984. However, in those 10 years, lots of Labour politicians have said, but you must also look at what Margaret Thatcher's regime did to suppress the voice of Sikhs in this country. And therefore, we are fairly confident a Labour government should be able to turn around to an Indian government and say, this is a matter for the UK and the UK alone about what our government did, and we're accountable to the public in the UK.
And again, I'm trying not to get dragged down into this, but it does pursue a particular, I think, area that I've been particularly focusing on and trying to really investigate. And I think you've really hit the nail on the head there when you talk about governments in opposition. They make all sorts of big promises. As soon as they're in government, and it does seem to actually happen to both mainstream parties, as soon as they are elected, they become into government, then of course the tune changes. Now, you've referenced there that it's pressure, or your assumption is it's pressure from overseas. Do you think, and again, my suspicions have always wondered, is there, and it's hard to describe it, but let's say, is there a British state, a British establishment, let's call it the dark state to even be conspiratorial about it, but do you think there is a hidden entity within the British establishment that essentially is calling the shots? They have their own agenda, whatever that agenda is, and there does seem to be some sort of collusion, is that a strong word? I don't know, but there is some sort of relationship, the historic relationship with India that is setting an agenda. And every time a government comes in with all these promises, of course, their tune does start to dissolve a little. And again, I'll give one example of this line of thought. It was when David Lammy became Foreign Secretary, and prior to taking government, he used the word, and referring back to Jagtar Singh Johal, he referred to arbitrary detention, as in fact did Sir Keir Starmer referred to this arbitrary detention of Jagtar Singh Johal. Since election, they have both refused to repeat that very phrase when asked about Jaggy. And again, it implies that something or somebody has leaned on them with another agenda, and they suddenly find themselves unable to make these sort of things. Again, it's a bit of a rabbit hole, but do you think there is anything in that, or do you think it's more conspiratorial more than anything else?
No, I think, Angus, you have touched upon a matter that we often talk about, which is clearly there is a relationship with Britain and India which goes back centuries. And what the Indian state has successfully done since 1947 has tried to ensure that the British government, irrespective of which colour it is, or even British politicians, do not criticise what happens in India. And it's almost like we called it the blackmail card. Now, it's more than 75 years since India gained its independence. And what we're saying, and people like me who were born here, is we had nothing to do with the atrocities carried out by the British in India, like the Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 1919 and various other things. And why should we have to suffer? We want our government to actually challenge when things go wrong in India. And what we found, this is consistent, that the Foreign Office and the officials and the establishment have almost made a decision they will not publicly be critical of India. Now, this defies all logic when we pick up the newspapers and we see what the current Indian regime has been doing for the last decade in terms of minorities, women, Dalits, you name it. And it's almost become a laughing stock. The UK government and all official documents virtually stay silent on this. And if we roll the clock back, Narendra Modi, the current Prime Minister of India, was de facto banned from the US, banned from Europe. And it was only when he was about to become Prime Minister did the British and the Americans start reaching out to him as the Chief Minister of Gujarat. And that is the harsh reality of governments, is governments have to deal with all sorts when they come to power. But what we're saying is in the recent past, India has now taken its whole approach abroad, and they've taken it to the back garden of the US, Canada, Britain. And now is the time for our politicians and our governments to stand up to that and say, do you really believe in the rule of law? Do you really stand up for your sovereignty? And we think we're on the winning side now, that India's been exposed. And what we're hoping is that a Labour government will have the courage to stand up for its citizens like Jagtar and like others I can name that are in India and are also in prison that are not talked about, and actually say they are British nationals and we have a duty, we have policies that we must follow. And I think what David Lammy demonstrated in his interview to the BBC or answering questions in Parliament about this is you could say whatever you want in opposition, but when you're in government and then when you're having to see your respective counterpart, it could well be in those private meetings that David Lammy, and we are reasonably confident he did this, he actually explained what the UK government policy is, that if a British national is in arbitrary detention, it's their duty to call for their release. And we think what he got back in response from his counterpart was, don't interfere in our legal process. There's an ongoing investigation in the court system. And that sort of came out in the interviews and what he said in Parliament. And what we've said in the recent weeks is when Jagtar was denied bail in the 7 remaining cases, and I know you interviewed Gurpreet about this, what we said is, don't forget, when his wife came to the UK in April 2019, more than 5 years ago, she was invited by Jeremy Hunt, the Foreign Secretary. And Jeremy Hunt told her to her face and Gurpreet that Jagtar would not get a fair trial in India. Now that just reminds me of 5 years later, why is any UK government, Conservative or Labour, referring to a legal system where they know a person's been tortured, they've signed blank sheets of paper, have made false confessions, and it's been 7 years, and those cases will never see the light of day. And if you know that in government, surely you reach a point where diplomacy is one thing, but you actually have to come out publicly and actually say that. But that's something that we're leaving Gurpreet, David Lammy, and Gurpreet's MP, a Labour MP, who's replaced Martin Doherty Hughes, to actually say, what we want is his release and return to the UK. How you do it is up to you. You're in government.
Yeah. Principles over diplomacy is that's the big argument, and I think the rule of law. You touched on about the rule of law, and to bring it sort of back onto topic, I think one of the key things that came out in this motion was this demand that, and referring back to the rule of law, is that any inquiry that should be launched by the British Labour government into the events of 1984 should be led by a judge. The motion calls for a judge-led inquiry. Could you talk about that? Can you let us know why that is significant? What is important about it being a judge-led inquiry?
I think the difficulty with language is if you say inquiry, well, David Cameron got his cabinet secretary to do what was called an internal review. And he decided what the terms of reference, he decided on the period he wanted to look at. And the reason why we say inquiry, and then we go on to say public inquiry led by a judge, and probably a high court judge, a retired high court judge, is we know before we even get into the details, this involves the SAS. So there's going to be highly sensitive information that only a high court judge or a retired high court judge could look at. So if you appointed someone else who didn't have that background or that clearance, they will not be able to look at those reports that have still not been released more than 10 years later about what advice did that SAS officer give. And I would also argue in 2018, when Phil Miller took the Cabinet Office to a tribunal, and myself and Phil were the two witnesses in a 3-day tribunal. The judge and the two lay people ruled in favour and against the Cabinet Office But the argument the Cabinet Office put up, and the person who was giving evidence on behalf of the government is the current permanent secretary of the Foreign Office. He argued that if those papers were to come out now, it would damage relations between India and the UK. And what the judge said in his ruling, that the public interest outweighed that almost false argument. Why would the current BJP government be concerned about the advice that Margaret Thatcher gave to Indira Gandhi? And I think that sent a very clear message to effectively the current permanent secretary of the Foreign Office, that if this ever gets to a judge and the public, because the public serve the right, not even the Sikh committee, the public needs to know why our government gave advice on sacking the holiest of holy places to the Sikhs. It just, even now, 40 years later, it sounds incredible that, governments talk about don't interfere about what happens in our country. India played that blackmail card. Well, why did you seek the advice of Margaret Thatcher and the SAS to attack your own people using tanks?
Yeah, it is. And I think through the lens of time, it's astonishing, isn't it? Yeah, it does. It's yeah. Okay. Well, fingers crossed that that motion carries a lot of weight, and we'll see some action from the Labour government on that. Let's move things forward, Dabinderjit. Let's move on to the convention in the Midlands here in the UK a couple of weeks ago. Could you talk? We'll go through the high level conclusions from the convention in a moment. Could you just give us a quick sort of summary of what the convention was about, who was in attendance, and just a little bit of background, what it was all about?
And a bit of history on this, Angus, and the press release touched upon this, that the whole history of the Federation can actually be traced back to the events of June 1984. So one of the people that was killed was the president of what was called the All India Sikh Students Federation, Dabinderjit Singh. He was almost Satluj Singh OBE's right-hand man, and he was killed. And one of his dreams was to see the Sikhs across the globe, particularly the youth, get organised. And therefore, in September 1984, the nephew of Satluj Singh OBE, when he was in the UK, came to the UK, talked to lots of Sikhs, particularly youngsters, because people felt hurt about what had happened in June 1984. And in September 1984, an organisation called the International Sikh Federation was launched, and it went global. Canada, Far East, America, places in Europe. And it became a really powerful organisation. In 1985, in the UK, the International Sikh Federation had a proper membership. It was 25,000. I remember, because I was in university in those days, that actually it had become a massive organisation. And if I fast forward to 2001, the International Sikh Federation was banned in the UK. And I can, hand on my heart, say, as a direct result of Indian government pressure on the Labour government at the time, and Jack Straw, because since then we've had the ban removed in 2016, 8 years ago, in the UK and throughout Europe. And yet, it shows how governments can lean on governments to say, can you silence, can you ban organisations in your country that they hadn't even banned in India? They didn't ban the International Sikh Federation until after 9/11 and a law called Quota in December. So basically, Angus, what we've got is a situation whereby the history of the Federation was it was banned in 2001, and then the Sikh Federation UK was set up in 2003. And therefore, on the 15th of September, we are marking 40 years of the existence of the Federation. And that's why we just say the Federation, because it's the world's worst kept secret that there is a link between the International Sikh Federation and Sikh Federation UK. And it was really important, therefore, at that 40th anniversary, to take stock of where we are now and what we need for the future. And that is reflected in some of the changes and some of the announcements that were made on that day.
Okay, Davinder. Well, let's just take a look at some of those key changes and announcements that were made. Let's take a look at the high level summary. So the first one was a major reorganisation of the Sikh Federation UK with new and younger leadership working under a Panj Pardani collective leadership system to work with the UK government and take forward the struggle for Sikh independence on the international stage. Could you talk us through that? Can you also explain what Panj Pardani means as well?
Yeah. So Panj is five, and Pradhan means like chairs or presidents. So it's like saying there are five presidents. And the reason why that's so important, and actually we're going back to the history of Guru Gobind Singh Ji when he created the Khalsa and the five beloved ones. What he said is that he was the last of the 10th Guru. Our Guru would be the Guru Granth Sahib Ji, our holy scriptures, and he invested the power in the five. And so what we've done is what we've said is actually the model that we should really be adopting worldwide in all Sikh organizations, in all Sikh institutions, is the concept of five, of collective leadership. Don't follow a Western model, which is you must have a leader, because having a community leader is a recipe for disaster. It was a disaster in 1947 where two or three people effectively signed off, the need for Sikhs to have their own homeland. We think the concept of the five, and then the five having going back to the masses to get endorsement, is the way forward. So we thought, well, let's walk the talk. So we announced on that day that we would have five, and we call them lead executives. So we have a 15-member national executive team, but we have five individuals who are all fully practicing Sikhs that effectively lead the organization, and we make collective decisions. So we don't leave it to a president or a chair. That concept has now gone. And the reaction we've had worldwide, because that convention was broadcast in over 100 countries, and weeks later, it's being repeated, and people have watched it 4 or 5 hours. And the one thing that comes back from all other things is what you've done in the UK is historic. And it's momentous because you've actually gone back to the tradition of the five. But not only that, you've said we need 5 British-born Sikhs. You need a team of British-born Sikhs to lead the way, because we live in a world that has changed from 1984. And at the same time, that experience and those people that started this whole process off, they're also part of this process. They form a strategy board that meets monthly with the National Executive. In fact, we had our first meeting yesterday of the strategy board. And we think that that collective model of inclusivity, we have a team of 15 women as well alongside, just means we are benefiting from all aspects of the community in the UK. And we believe this is going to be replicated across the globe in different countries and in different organizations. And I think, I was literally talking to a politician just for this show, and I'm going to be calling a minister, actually, believe it or not, this afternoon, to talk to them about why our Sikh model of representation is far stronger than the Western model, and actually saying that's how governments need to deal with our community.
I feel a new political party with a new agenda coming on there, Dabinderjit, with a new style of governance in the UK.
No, I think what we're saying is this: now we would run a Sikh state, but not necessarily, we can't dictate to Western states their presidents and prime ministers. I think they'll stick with that for many years to come.
And who's to say it's any better? I think we could very much argue that maybe the Panj system is probably a stronger system. And I understand. Am I correct in thinking the Sikh Empire back in the 19th century followed that same model?
I still think it was a different time where you had obviously Maharaja Ranjit Singh and you had Banda Singh Bahadur before that in 1710. But the concept of the five was even Maharaja Ranjit Singh had to listen to the wishes of the five when it came to the Golden Temple. He had to appear before the Akal Takht. And these are building blocks for a future Sikh homeland that we've been practically working on to say, all right, are we going to have a constitution? How's it going to be run? The daily prayer for the well-being of all. These are concepts that people just haven't understood, and they've been sort of demonized by this word Khalistan. We want to win back that word and make it legitimate to actually say, look at our faith, look at the way we've ruled in the past. And actually, this is a positive thing, not just for the Indian subcontinent, but actually for the globe.
Okay, well, let's move on to the next high-level summary conclusion. This is a really powerful one. The coordinated international campaign to have India officially declared a rogue state, following, of course, its exposure over the last 12 months on the international stage for transnational repression, state-sponsored terrorism and political interference abroad. This is ambitious, is it not, Dabinderjit?
Yes and no, because we've obviously made that announcement and said there's going to be an international campaign. And often what happens in campaigns is you raise awareness. And if we start to break down the concept of what defines a rogue state, actually it starts off with, does the state operate democratically or has it become authoritarian? And what we've seen in the last decade under Narendra Modi is, don't ask us, ask all the independent organizations that have said it's been sliding away from democracy towards an autocracy. Actually, Narendra Modi had a bit of a setback in the last elections where they got fewer politicians, but nonetheless, the country was moving to a one-party state. Now, that is the first stage of being declared a rogue state, that you become authoritarian, you start to control the judiciary, you control the media, and you control the whole apparatus that exists within the country. But the next stage is you then start to eliminate opposition, but not just opposition in your country, but opposition abroad. And therefore, if you move to transnational repression and effectively the killing of Sikh activists abroad, that is a step too far for many countries, particularly in the West. But on top of that, what we're saying, and this is set out in more detail in the press release, if you look at the role of India in global politics, its alignment with Russia, its support for Russia in the context of Ukraine, that should matter to every single European country. If they were brave enough to call out India, I don't think we'll be in this mess. India is also aligned with Iran. It's also aligned with Afghanistan. And in recent weeks and months, it's been opening up friendly negotiations with China. Now, if you take that totality together, authoritarian state, transnational oppression, and its global policy, then I think governments around the globe should be actually saying, well, maybe the Sikhs have got a point here. What is a rogue state? And perhaps India meets that definition better than most rogue states like Syria, etc. The only issue, I guess, is it's the most populous state in the world. And it's a big market for many countries. And that's why I think they hesitate with the current, what I would say is the democratic setup in the Indian subcontinent.
Well, this is, to me, it's quite a shrewd move following this line of thought, because, of course, it's ratcheting up the legal situation, certainly here in the UK and certainly across the West as well. If it is successfully declared officially in the West as a rogue state, that does imply a lot of legal obligations on governments to then act in certain ways. So do you think it was designed as a deliberate stepping stone almost to, I would say, legally ratchet up the stakes so that it then obliges a government? It has a legal tick box saying, oh, it is officially declared as a rogue state, so therefore I now have to take the following actions. So it is a stepping stone towards really, apart from Khalistan, it's pressuring India to become more aligned with us on a geopolitical perspective as well as commercial and everything else.
I think what it does, Angus, is it opens up a conversation that perhaps a lot of governments are not prepared to have, especially publicly. And what we're saying is, actually, this conversation does need to go on for the very reason that India is such a populous country. And it has many people that live in India, like the Sikhs, like other people in other states, that are asking for greater rights, greater autonomy, but India's denying them through their own processes. And when they start to come to your garden and taking the law into their own hands, now is the time to stand up to India. And I think actually a campaign to officially declare India a rogue state is actually also a message, and I know you've got to go on to talk about this, that actually the American administration, when I say the administration, I'm not bothered about whether it's Joe Biden today or Donald Trump tomorrow. The administration has reached their own conclusion that India, in its current form, cannot be trusted. It cannot be trusted in terms of its global relationships with some of the countries I mentioned. It cannot be trusted even when it comes to fair trade. And it cannot be trusted when it comes to the rule of law. And when a superpower like America and the administration reach that conclusion, then that should send, and it has sent, alarm bells ringing in India that we now have a superpower that has been openly holding meetings. And I was in the States, I mentioned this, there have already been 2 meetings, a third one coming up in November, where in the meeting, they've had a 10-minute presentation on the Sikh homeland, the history and where we are now with transnational oppression. And I'm talking about people very senior in the US administration. And the fact that they're talking about it, and Sikhs that have attended those meetings are talking about it, is they want India to know that you have a superpower that is looking at a different model for South Asia. And I know you'll probably go on to this, so I might as well mention it now. Clearly, the US is not the only superpower that's interested. There's another neighbor on the other side of India called China, which also occasionally shows some interest about what's happening in different parts of India. And they're equally aware of that. And the third, what I would call attempt by a country to become a superpower, is India itself. Because India is well aware that the Americans and Chinese are putting out either open overtures about a Sikh homeland or are approaching people to talk about this. And they themselves are also thinking, hold on a minute, look at this whole history. Pre-independence, post-independence, the Sikhs have always led the way in any independence movement, the Indian independence movement. That's why they were the third party around the table. And I say this in the phrase I've used, the cookie could easily crumble for India. So I've talked about people in other states not being happy. The one group of people, and the farmers' protest was this, is if the Sikhs are unhappy, and we've seen that in recent elections, they've elected people like Amritpal Singh and the son of Beyant Singh who killed Indira Gandhi. We're talking about 2024. 40 years later, the people of Punjab seem to be unhappy with those that run India. And I think we could see things happening very quickly when superpowers are involved. And India itself is saying, we need to do damage limitation here. This has now gone too far.
Do you think, Rahul Gandhi, for example, recently, he raised a bit of a political furore about statements he made recently referring to the Sikh population and, of course, the minorities and the oppression of the minorities. And he obviously upset certainly a lot on the right wing in India. Do you think if, for example, he came to power, if there was a change of administration in India and Rahul Gandhi and Congress took power, now, of course, what he said obviously very much aligns with the general feeling from the Sikh community, for example. Do you think that was simply political opportunism, just to try and drum up a bit of support from the minorities? Or do you think and I don't want to go too far off topic on here, but do you think if there is a change of government back to Congress, and of course Congress has a huge baggage with it, with Indira Gandhi and etc., and of course that whole dynasty, the Gandhi dynasty, but do you think moving forward that a Gandhi government, a Rahul Gandhi government and a Congress government, they might have a different attitude towards all this?
I think, Angus, I'll try and answer this the best I can in terms of I can't envisage Rahul Gandhi coming to power given we've just had elections where all the opposition parties came together and they could not defeat the ruling party that's been in power for 10 years. So although it's a setback for a one-party state, I think the Hindutva movement and the way people have been controlled, the media's been controlled, journalists, NGOs, I think to reverse that could take a whole lifetime. And therefore, I don't see any, in my lifetime, I can't see Rahul Gandhi ever becoming Prime Minister or even the Congress coming to power. But I think what his statement did was to show how slightly naive he was by giving that example, because by giving that example, it allowed the current BJP to point to, and they started talking about that word, genocide again, the genocide 40 years ago, and how Congress were responsible for the attack in June 1984 and what happened in terms of after Indira Gandhi was killed. And so the totality of his statement in America around that, as he's had the current ruling party up in arms and complaining about what the Congress did to the Sikhs. And what we said is we see no difference between what the Congress did 40 years ago and what the BJP is doing now. It's probably more sophisticated now from the BJP, but nonetheless, both of them were set on the model that was there in the Indian constitution. But they don't actually regard Sikhs even as a separate faith. Even the Indian constitution says we're effectively Hindus that wear turbans and practice our faith. That's more or less what it says about Jains, Buddhists, and Sikhs in the way the constitution has been drafted. And I think deep down, that is the issue that I don't think is going to make any difference when we see people change power. We've had all sorts of governments of all political persuasions since 1947, but the Constitution of 1951 has not been changed with that respect. And therefore, Sikhs have never signed up to the Indian Constitution. And I think the reason for that is the promises that were made before 1947 were forgotten to the Sikhs. And the Sikh leadership at the time made a mistake. And that's why our starting point is we must re-establish a Sikh homeland. If in years to come, different states of India get more autonomy because the government of the day feels that if they don't give that autonomy, they could lose power, well, time will tell. But our demand will remain because of our experience that we must have our own homeland. And I think there'll be lots of non-Sikhs that understand Sikhs, live with Sikhs, have Sikh friends, will understand, actually, this would be a good thing if that state is run on the same principles that Maharaja Ranjit Singh or Banda Singh Bahadur did when a Sikh kingdom did exist.
Okay, well, let's get back on topic and back to the convention, and let's go on to the next one, which of course is linked to everything that we're talking about. And this was the unveiling of a new global structure of the Federation over the coming weeks, based on the UK model, beginning with the declaration of Sikh Federation Canada towards the end of, well, what was September and now early October. So clearly there is a move to try and align the various organisations around the globe to form a bit of a united front. Can you give us, again, a bit of a background and talk around what's going on here? What is the intention here?
So I think, Angus, I've already touched on it before, that 40 years ago, an organisation called the International Sikh Federation came to existence, and it existed in a number of countries. What we've now got is we've got remnants of that organisation existing in its various forms at a national level in about a dozen countries. And what we've been talking about is to bring that all together. And on the 12th, 13th and 14th of October in the UK, there will be a press conference followed by an event at Govt and then an event in Parliament. We'll be formally announcing the setting up of that international structure. It will operate in 5 regions: UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Europe. And so some of the things is, this is a stepping stone. It's not the final stage. It's a stepping stone to create the sort of thing we've done here at the UK level at an international level. So we have the right people, the right resources who could sit around the table tomorrow and talk about, all right, do the Americans, Chinese, or the Indians want to discuss around a table the re-establishment of a Sikh homeland? That we have the right skill sets, the right leadership, and this is just the first stage. So more will be revealed later this month in the UK, where we will have people from all those regions I've just mentioned attending and speaking. And I would say watch the space, because that is just the first step, but actually it will be the start of what we believe could be a process whereby governments, the United Nations, the EU, start to say, hold on a minute, they do have something here, a structure here. They have the individuals, they have the right skill sets, that actually we can see that they could form their administration. And ultimately, that's where we'll end up, is having an administration for Khalistan.
Is this, just out of curiosity, is this generated from the UK or the UK community, or has it already been coordinated internationally? Where's the momentum coming from?
It's something actually that's been happening over several years, and the UK has played a key part in this. But I would also say the events of the last 18 months in Canada and America, the revelations that have come out of Australia, has meant the Five Eyes nations have had to step up a bit. But this has been deliberately set up in such a way that it involves only the diaspora Sikhs, not the Sikhs living in India. And there's a reason for that, because there is a connection between this setup and those in India, i.e. Sikhs in India, but it's deliberately being kept as a sort of dotted line. And the reason for that is those people that exist in India that share the same thoughts as us are actually saying it's the only way to protect them. And also their line is, because they're the ones that get approached by the Indian state, is to say, if you want to negotiate, our team's sitting out there. Because it'll be the worst thing to have a team in India, because they will be compromised from the word go, because they live there. And so this is actually done in very close association with not one, not two, but many groups of Sikhs in India that are like-minded and can see that actually the world is changing very quickly, and we need to be prepared to deal with what we see as an opportunity rather than a threat.
Do you think one thing that we've often reported about is the fragmentation of the Sikh community, particularly in the Punjab? And it's almost evidence of a very successful RSS Hindutva-driven agenda to deliberately divide the community. And they, of course, have infiltrated many of the organisations. They've got many of their place people in key positions, particularly in the Punjab as well. Have you, when you were putting all this together and trying to coordinate and align internationally, have you found any of this fragmentation? Have you found any resistance to, or any bodies trying to undermine this coordination, this alignment?
At one level, no, Angus, we haven't, because what we're doing is this first step is bring together those people that are like-minded in the first place. I think when we eventually move towards bringing everybody together for a Khalistan administration, that is when we will experience that challenge of how do you get people from that aren't necessarily like-minded to keep focused on the ultimate goal. And I think the trouble with what the Indian state has done over many, many years is they've learned from the British about divide and rule. And therefore they do create division, they create organizations, and they infiltrate organizations. And that's why the model we're setting up is actually quite watertight in terms of those people that will be around a negotiating table, and also what the process is around what parameters they will have to negotiate and how they feed back to the wider Sikh community. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be perfect, but the thing is you have to have somebody or individuals that take the lead. And I think some of the concepts I started with, like Panch Pradhani, that sense of collective leadership, is ultimately a way you can avoid the mistakes that have been made in the past.
When I first reported on the story just a couple of days ago, I did actually make the observation that this whole conclusion, all these conclusions, really are sending a warning shot across India's bows. Do you think Narendra Modi and the BJP will be raising a rather large eyebrow? Do you think they're going to be a little bit worried about what's going on here and this international coordination?
I think they're more than worried because we started off the program talking about the resolution in Derby. You then talked about the announcement of the convention. None of the English-speaking newspapers in India have covered any of this. And this is big news. The Punjabi media has in India covered this, but not the English media. And the reason is they don't know how to handle it because the whole thing is very above board. It's very democratic and it makes a lot of sense. So how do they then write about this? Because after all, it's a media that's controlled largely by the BJP. They don't want to report on this. So there's almost an element of censorship around this. And I would say to anyone, show me the newspaper articles in the last month about this. There are none in India. Normally, a small thing happens and they make it into big news in India. But they're not reporting on this because actually they realize this is making a lot of sense, common sense, where even the people of India, i.e. non-Sikhs, might start to think, hold on a minute, we remember the farmers' process, we remember what the role of the Sikhs there was. And a lot of people start saying, well, if you're going to label all these people as Khalistanis, which is what the government tried to do, then others said, we want to be Khalistanis. And these are people that didn't even belong to the Sikh faith. But that is ultimately where we're going with this, that if you have a Sikh homeland that respects people's faith and their freedoms and allows them to practice their faith, that's what India has demonized since the word Khalistan was first introduced. And that's where we think that India is already aware that things have changed. And it's what they do, their next steps. Do they continue with their transnational repression and targeting the diaspora? Or what we're saying is we're standing up to you. Here we are. Either come and get us or sit around the table with us. But this isn't about people like me and others. We will be replaced. We can be replaced because the whole point is we don't have a single leader. We have hundreds, if not thousands of people that believe that Sikhs deserve their freedom.
A very powerful message, Dabinderjit. Okay, well, I'd like just for the last few minutes of our discussion today, just to take a look at some of the issues that have been taken up by the community with ministers since that convention. Of course, there's been this list of 10 issues highlighted. If we could, Dabinderjit, just take a minute or so on each one of these as we're running out of time, but I would like just to maybe cherry pick some of these for quick discussions. And the first one is collection of good quality data on Sikhs by public bodies. And I guess this is referring to the census that occurs every 10 years. And this is actually collecting, I guess, demographic information.
Yeah, so Angus, I'll touch upon this, but I'll give a general overview as well. So the week after the convention, we wrote to basically 6 different cabinet ministers. And that first issue about better collection of data is actually to do with the Cabinet Office, because the Cabinet Office has the overall responsibility. So actually, some of these issues are jointly owned by departments, such as the Home Office and the Communities Department. Others are solely owned by individual departments. So that is very much linked to the Sikh Manifesto issue around we may not have a future census. There is a project called the Harmonisation Project that's ongoing. And therefore, we are challenging with examples the Cabinet Office ministers to meet us and say, what are your future plans for the census? How does government make decisions because you don't have accurate data about Sikhs? Because if you're not going to have another census, then your harmonisation project has to recommend that information on Sikhs as an ethnicity as well as a religion is collected. And I think that's probably the way forward, that we set these things in motion. And over the next 3 months, we can obviously report back via the media the extent to which ministers are listening, meeting, and actually starting to put some of the manifesto into effect.
Right. And the next few ones, I guess, relate to legislation. We've got the new Equality, Race and Disability Act. There's recognising anti-Sikh hate and a statutory code of practice on the Sikh articles of faith. So I guess, that's aiming at the legislature there to improve just the legal situation of the community.
That's right, Angus. And I think what it is that these are issues that even Satluj TV viewers, particularly in Britain, will be familiar with because they're in the Sikh manifesto. Now, some of them will require legislation, some of them will require changes in policy within departments, but none of these are issues that should really be of any concern to the Indian government. These are UK-based organisations about Sikhs living in this country, and we think there have been various promises made by the Labour government on these. And these are things we're hoping they start to work on sooner rather than later, that we can actually deliver on some of these in 12 months, and some that may take a bit longer, 2 or 3 years even.
Yeah, we'll keep an eye on progress on those and report accordingly. And then we come on to the educational aspect. It's improving the education of the Sikh faith and its history, and in turn safeguarding Sikh artefacts here in the UK.
Yeah, and again, these are two very specific issues. So Bridget Phillipson, who's the Secretary of State for Education, we wrote to, and in fact got a response back yesterday about the first of those. And the second issue is actually for Lisa Nandy as the Culture Secretary, because she's responsible for the various museums, etc. But we have been seeing that as soon as we get into the artifacts issue, this is where the Indian subcontinent and particularly India starts to come into this, because what we've been seeing is the Narendra Modi government has been pressuring not just the UK government, but the US as well, to return things that they argue belong to them. And the manifesto makes this very clear. Sikh artifacts that exist in the UK were largely following the Anglo-Sikh wars, and they belong to the Sikh nation. They're being held effectively in trust. And we think this is going to be a win-win situation for the Culture Secretary if the British Sikh community are saying, no, safeguard those here in this country, because they don't belong to India, they don't belong to Pakistan, they belong to the Sikh people.
Indeed, and by extension, Khalistan, when it's established.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we come on to the big subjects, transnational repression, foreign political interference. I won't go into that because we've talked a lot about that. The release of Jagtar Singh Johal, I guess a bit more of a coordinated effort to pressure our government on that.
Yeah, and I think the range of issues set out there, apart from the Jallianwala Bagh apology, the 1984 inquiry is probably the other one. These are all issues that are going to be, in a way, tougher to deliver, as we've seen with Jagtar Singh Johal, that you can say one thing in opposition, but I always believe in one thing. Where there's a will, there's a way. If there's a will to get Jagtar released and returned to the UK, then there's always a way. Or otherwise, Keir Starmer, David Lammy should just pack their bags and leave. They're not capable of governing the country. If they can't stand up for a British citizen, and I think it's similar on the other issues there. Sikhs deserve, and the public deserve, the truth on 1984. And even with the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, on the 100th anniversary, the Labour leader at the time, who was Jeremy Corbyn, said in Prime Minister's questions, a Labour Prime Minister would make an apology. Now, that is an issue that cuts across base. But even, it might be one that pleases the Indian government, believe it or not, if Britain apologise for what they did in 1919. But what we shouldn't forget, this isn't an apology to India. It's an apology to those that were killed. The vast majority were Sikhs. And the Sikhs would therefore, worldwide, see this apology from Keir Starmer, assuming he's the Prime Minister. And there's a finite time for that. And I think next April is when we expect the British Prime Minister to come good and apologise. And if not, there will be many politicians in the Labour Party that will be asking, why can't we do this? You can't use the India card here.
Indeed, and I have no doubt it'll be the Sikh community who will be holding each respective government to account going forward. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but we must leave it there. But we will no doubt be speaking again on other topics that we have still yet to discuss, still lots to talk about. Dabinderjit Singh, it's been an absolute pleasure as always. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching the Satluj TV podcast. We will see you next time.